Ikim FM, inspirasi utama anda. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon to our dear listeners of Ikim FM. Welcome to this special interview. I'm your host, Patricia Afrina. Alhamdulillah, thank you very much for listening to us from wherever you are. Either you are listening to this through radio or even through our social media pages, Facebook and YouTube. So in this special interview so far, we have covered a wide range of issues from various perspectives and diverse expert backgrounds. And in this episode, we'll be discussing on the topic hate speech. So this discussion is actually inspired by a book published by the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations titled From Hate to Hope, A Holistic Approach to Address Hate Speech. And in this interview, we aim to look at the main issues highlighted in the book. And joining me in the studio is the author of the book, Dr. Murni Wan Mohd Nor, who is also an expert researcher at the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations. Welcome to the studio, Dr. Murni.
Thank you so much for having me, Patricia. I'm so happy to be here.
Alhamdulillah, it's such a pleasure to have you in our studio today, Doctor. So, Doctor, as I mentioned in the introduction just now, that our main aim for this interview is to talk about the hate speech, and I think it is a prominent issue nowadays. Perhaps not prominent in Malaysia, but this is actually something that is very serious in the Western countries. So, before we go into the conversation itself, perhaps, Doctor, can you share with us about the book? Here, the title, From Hate to Hope, A Holistic Approach to Address the Hate Speech. What are the main issues highlighted in the book, and what inspired you or motivated you to write the book?
Right. Thank you for that important question. This is actually the book. I brought it with me. It's just recently been published and it will be launched next year by IDFR. And the reason why I wrote this book is actually it is a summary of my research for the last 14 years in which I've conducted on hate speech, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and so on. And it represents not only the issues of hate speech internationally, but also in Malaysia, because the situation of hate speech in Malaysia is quite serious as well, although as you rightly mentioned, it might not be as serious as the situation in other countries, Western countries, but it is still a concerning problem, and it is something that we need to address and prevent before things escalate to worse proportions. So the reason why I wrote it is because I strongly believe that there needs to be more awareness about what hate speech is and what is the impact of hate speech, not only among the community and communities of different racial and religious groups and so on, but also its impact on national policies, foreign policies, diplomatic relations, and so on. Yeah.
And if you look at, I believe that whenever we try to tackle an issue, it is important for us to understand at the very root of it. And here we shall start with defining about what defined as hate speech.
Right.
So if you look at it broadly or through the surface, on the surface, right? So it seems like defining hate speech seems straightforward because you have the word hate and speech. So we know that it means hateful speech. But given the complexity and the weight of this issue, as you mentioned, how it can involve in many things, so and even through national policies, for example, that mere definition is just the surface of the matter. So what are the best ways we can better define the meaning of hate speech to capture its multifaceted nature?
Right. So it's really complex to perfectly define hate speech, and there is no universal definition for what it is. The United Nations has a definition for it. The European Council has a definition for it. And so the definition would differ according to the jurisdiction. And in Malaysia, we do not have a legal definition of what hate speech is, which results in a lot of confusion among the public as to what it means. And you did mention that it seems like it's straightforward because it's hate and it's speech, so we understand that it means hateful speech. But how we determine what is hateful depends on the context and what one group understands hate speech to mean might differ according to their historical background, their lived-in experiences. So among the things that we need to consider when we come up with the definition of hate speech is to understand the context of the people within that particular community, within that country, the historical underpinnings of the nation, and so on. Because a definition should reflect the condition of the people in which we are trying to legislate.
It's very interesting to know that there's actually no, I would say, objective, I would say, a unified definition on the what defined as hate speech.
Right.
So perhaps I think, is it because of the other matter, which is the freedom of speech? As we know, it is usually closely related to the hate speech, where there's a gray line between what can be counted as freedom of speech and what can be counted as the hate speech.
Right.
So how can we identify those two?
Right. So, again, that's why I've always talked about the importance of having a better national framework for addressing hate speech, and that starts with having an acceptable definition within the legal framework for what hate speech is, because then it becomes clearer to the public as well, and that becomes a guideline for them. So currently we do not have that yet. So I think it's really important for us to understand that even when we talk about freedom of expression could not be limitless. Even in Western countries, they also have limitations upon this freedom. And among the limitations, legitimate limitations, is to actually protect people from harm. And hate speech has many harms that is well documented. But if we want to, at least in Malaysia, understand the line between freedom of expression and hateful expression, we need to consider the kind of hateful speech and its impact upon society. This does not mean that every offensive speech should be punishable. I think a lot of people misunderstand me when I talk about hate speech. They think that, oh, then are we going to penalize everything just because someone's feelings got hurt? The law cannot penalize or should not penalize everyone, even if what is said happened to be offensive. That's also why we need to understand and have a legal definition for it, because the law would be able to differentiate between minor instances of hate speech and more serious instances of hate speech, which may require legal intervention. And so I would say that hate speech that requires legal intervention are hate speech of a more serious nature, and that also depends on the context. So, for example, if a particular person of great influence were to say something that's hateful, the impact that this hate speech that is being said by a particular influential person has greater impact and greater damage than a hateful speech that is being said by someone with no influence. And so these are some of the things that the law also needs to take into consideration. We've seen that certain politicians in other countries, when they come up with hateful speech, it emboldens people, the citizens, and not only in that country but other countries to follow suit. And so these are one of the things that we need to consider when we want to balance between freedom of expression and the need to protect society from harmful speech.
Yes, and it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because it reminds me of, for an instance, about the situation that happening in Burma, the Rohingya, right? That the higher ups, especially for example, like the deputy minister, they encourage the people for the hate speech towards the Rohingya, where they call the Rohingya as, all these sort of names, for example, like past or anything less than human. So here we should, especially, I agree that you mentioned about the legal intervention. How can it be involved in it, especially for the influential people to have a say about that. And also talking about going back into the legal intervention, right? This is my perspective as a citizen. Would it mean that we have to risk about censorship? Why I'm saying that is because we are putting the government as those in charge or involved in the legal system to have a say on what is right or what is wrong.
Right.
So what is your thought on that?
I think that when we want to come up with a proper framework to address hate speech, we need to have a multi-stakeholder engagement, because, again, what is hateful to me might not be something that's hateful to people from other groups, because we need to understand the perspective of group that is being targeted by hate speech. And so that's why I am in the midst of finalizing my research in order to understand what is hate speech to people of different racial and religious groups, because we need to understand the perspective of other people. So I think it is really important, before we come up with the legislative framework to address this really complex issue, we need to actually take the time to understand what is hateful and why it is hateful to people of different groups, because that's the first thing that we need to look into. And we can't rush when we talk about these issues or when we want to come up with a law, because we need to have a proper engagement with different stakeholders, not just people from different racial and religious groups, but also people from the media, because we don't want to impinge freedom of the press as well. And so that is why we need to have a proper legislative framework for this, because we don't want to have a blanket legislation that could possibly be used against all types of offensive speech, even offensive speech of the most or of the least serious nature, because the law is not meant to penalize everyone for saying even minor offensive things. So the law is meant to actually make it clear what types of hate speech warrants legal intervention, because without this clear guideline, then it becomes very open to interpretation and can cause a lot of confusion, as well as difficulty in legal enforcement, which is some of the things that even the Royal Malaysian Police had revealed to me when I interviewed them with regards to getting data for my book.
But doctor, looking at it, hate speech is not something new. It's not a modern crisis. It has been happening for years.
Right.
But then why, I would say even the definition, they cannot come agree to what defines as definition. What are the challenges that, people are facing through whenever we try to impose or have, as you mentioned, as legal intervention into the matter?
Right. So I would like to explain that although we don't have a legal definition for hate speech specifically, we have many laws in Malaysia that could be used to protect against hate speech, right? So we have Section 233 of the Communications and Multimedia Act. We have the Sedition Act. We have Printing Presses and Publication Act. So we have several different laws that can be used to prevent or to punish hate speech, although it's not been defined specifically as such. But the challenge in coming up with something that is uniform or agreed by all is because it is a very complex issue, and because hate speech means different things to different people, which is why that stakeholder engagement is so important. We need to actually look at this issue from different angles. We need to consider academic freedom. We need to consider freedom of the press, and all these things. And so it does take a lot of time if we're going to actually come up with legal framework. But great things or important things sometimes can't be rushed. And so a lot of research, a lot of engagement needs to go into finalizing these issues before we can actually come up with a definition that most can agree with. And again, even if we have a definition, it could never be a definition that everyone agrees to. That's just not practical. But at least it could be a definition that reflects the realities of the Malaysian people and is in line with our current legal framework.
And doctor, in the early of this interview, we talk about how hate speech, can be involved in many things, especially how it will affect, for example, like economy and also the nationalism.
Right.
And going further into that, of course, no child is born with hatred, and hate is taught. This hate is taught. So how does this hatred evolve over time? And what are the fundamental causes for its spread? And how do the intersecting elements such as race, religion, and for example, just now nationalism and also economic inequality can contribute to its persistence?
That's a really good question. I wish we had an hour to explore all the different factors. But what I can say is I totally agree with you that hate is taught it is sometimes taught within the home, and that is something that my research reveals as well. But it is also taught sometimes unintentionally when we say certain offensive things over time that becomes normalized within society, and so then this offensive speech becomes repeated and repeated until it actually becomes a reality, and it becomes something that ends up causing racism and discrimination to the affected groups. So there are so many different factors that causes hate speech. A lot of it has a lot to do with ignorance. Maybe we perceive people who are different than us as a threat, for example. Like you mentioned the example of Rohingyas. But even in Malaysia, we have that perception towards Rohingyas as well, because I do a lot of research on online sentiments as reflected on social media comments. So a lot of people are using dehumanizing terms to describe refugees as something like pests. They are a tsunami of people, a swarm, and a swarm, as we know, refers to insects. And so when we use these kind of terms to describe refugees or any group in particular, it removes the human element from them, and it makes us view them, as something that can be wiped out. And we don't feel that bad about using these terms. And some people might think, oh, Dr. Murni is exaggerating things. But the genocide in Rwanda is proof of this, because the media played a great role in actually exacerbating these kind of negative stereotypes, which over time emboldens people to commit heinous crimes against the minorities at that time in Rwanda. And this is further compounded when politicians in Rwanda at that time encouraged the same. So there are so many different factors that perpetuates hate speech. Among them is also social or economic inequalities, and this is seen in Malaysia also with regards to our fear that migrants or refugees will take away the piece of our pie. For example, if we provide vaccines to refugees and things like that, they're not going to be enough for us. This sentiment also exists in the West with regards to Muslims, with regards to immigrants, due to the perception that these groups are a threat to the indigenous population. They will take away their jobs. They will threaten their legal system with, Sharia and things like that. And so these sentiments are quite apparent in all countries, and it reflects the insecurities of the people that believe groups that are different than them pose a threat to their existence and well-being.
And one of the other incident that I can think of example for that is if you look at the recent Southport stabbing on the 30th of July, where the far-right protesters clashed with police in Southport and damaged a mosque after misinformation about the attacker's identity. In here, attack of young children, if I'm not mistaken, the attack of the young children, and people are saying that the attacker is Muslim, when we found out they actually is not. So because of this, it caused, as we know, people got burned, and an apartment, and also mosque being damaged. So it shows that how powerful hate speech can be. Not just it can inflict damage in through psychological and also emotional, but also physical. And this is something that you should be concerned about. So perhaps other than that, can you share us with us more example of the damaging impact of hate speech, this one specifically to the communities and also nations?
I think you gave a great example, and that's an example that I actually explained in my book, actually. And if I could elaborate on that example a little bit more, because there's a lot to unpack there. We can see that hate speech, even after it has, and the misinformation, even after it has been debunked, failed to persuade the public at that time that it was not a Muslim perpetrator that conducted those heinous crimes. And so it indicates that once hate speech and negative perception of a particular group is ingrained in the minds of the people, it almost becomes difficult to change their minds about something. And that's why the riots continued after the misinformation was revealed and it was debunked.
Yes.
And this is very concerning. But what I also want to point out in the example is how the Muslim leaders and the Muslim community there responded to such heinous crimes and riots being done against them. Did they respond with more hate? They did not. And there was a Muslim imam of the mosque there who had actually opened their doors despite the protest because they wanted to have a proper dialogue with the rioters, with the public, for them to see that Islam is not the threat that they perceive it to be. And a lot of the people that had initially rioted against them became touched by the kind gesture of the imam, and it's reported that they ended up hugging each other, embracing each other. And I think we tend to see the negative, and of course the negative should be highlighted, but we really need to also see the positive as well. And even in instances of writing and provocation and hateful speech, the way that we respond is really important, because we can choose to be just as bad as them, or we can choose to respond to hate with what is better. And this is something that I explain in the book as well.
So, through your suggestion in the book, how should we respond to the hate speech?
So, I know it sounds cliche to talk about education, but again, one of the reasons or factors that perpetuate hate speech is ignorance or lack of education, right? So the best way to prevent hate speech to me would be more education or effective education. And education is not just meant for children, because I think we have this perception that when we educate people, we're just going to educate the young. No, education is lifelong journey all the way until we reach adulthood.
Yes.
And so this education with regards to hate speech, what's hateful, how can we say things in a better way, and things like that, is for all levels of society, including politicians, including the media, because our media is also guilty sometimes of using stereotypical terms that frame refugees in a negative light. And so education really is key here. We need to have media literacy. We need to have cultural and sensitivity training, because we may know what is offensive to us, but we may not be aware of what is offensive to others and why it is offensive. And if we knew why something is offensive to other groups, perhaps it would help us to refrain ourselves from engaging in such offensive speech. So I truly believe that education is the key, and this way of educating is not just through inculcating it through the syllabus or introducing a new subject, because we don't want to burden the education system more. But there are so many more subtle ways of educating the public at large with regards to the harms of hate speech. So, for example, I've also written a children's book. It's entitled When Love Heals Hate. And in this book, I have highlighted the harms of bullying someone based on their religious beliefs, because I wanted to have a book that could be used as a teaching tool, not just for teachers, but also for parents to have these important conversations with children. So the way that we want to educate society has to be very comprehensive and holistic. We also need to have more content. We call it countermeasures or counter speech. And why we call it as counter speech is because it is countermeasures to hate speech that is positive. Because we can't control what people consume on social media, and a lot of what they consume is negative, right? So what we can do is come up with more positive messages, more positive content, collaborate with influencers to come up with positive, heartwarming stories that highlight the beauty in diversity that is very much in existence in Malaysia today, that we may forget because we only choose to see what's negative. And so I think this requires a really collaborative approach with all stakeholders in order for it to be truly effective.
It's very interesting you mentioned about the things that are happening on social media. As we know, online hate speech is becoming more and more harmful, and I believe that many parents out there perhaps maybe haven't yet realized how concerning it is about how exposed their children towards this hate speech through the media, especially for the youngsters, right? They don't know to differentiate what is right and what is wrong, what is
Right.
morally right, what is morally wrong.
Right.
So can you share perhaps for our listeners out there, perhaps some of them or many of them are parents, how concerned should we be about the online hate speech and how powerful it can be? How can it be powerful to the point that it can impact us in the I would say the real world?
Right. Actually, hate speech is very concerning even in Malaysia, although Alhamdulillah, we do not have high levels of violence motivated by racial or religious factors. That is really great compared to other Western countries, actually. So that's something we should be proud of. But we don't want to wait for hate speech to escalate to greater proportions before we take the situation seriously. That's why I always talk about preventing it. And prevention can be really effective if we start from the home or within our own homes. And so, you know, just to share, when I was a child, 7 years old, people called me the K word, referring to the derogatory term that many people use to refer to Indians, because I had a tiny little mole in the middle of my forehead. And they also called me kafir because at the time when I masuk Darjah 1, I was just fresh off coming from the States, where I was living for about 4 years at the time. And so they called me kafir because during the times that I spoke English, of course I spoke Malay as well, but during the times I spoke English, I sounded like an American. And that was something that they said about me to tease me. And it was very traumatic. So when children as young as 7 years old are saying these things, they're learning from their environment. And sometimes they're learning these kind of language within their own homes, because perhaps some of the elderly around them are saying these things thinking that the children are not listening. But children are very observant and they listen to the things that we say. So we need to make sure that we always show a positive example to our children. And I mean, I'm not blaming parents, because sometimes we might not even know if what we're doing is not the best thing sometimes, right? Because we're all learning every single day.
Yes.
And that's why it's really important to try to put ourselves in other people's shoes and to try to understand why these kind of terms are not kind to be used to describe people from other races or other religious groups, because it results in this perception that they are the enemy, that they are threatening, and so on and so forth. And if these terms are used to describe us, we would not like it as well. It will make us feel like an outsider. And so as parents, I think it's very important for us to be intentional in teaching our children about these positive values. As Muslims, in the tradition of Islam, we have so many examples that we can highlight to our children. The Sunnah, for example, that highlight the tolerance of our Prophet, the tolerance in Islam with regards to the diversity of other people, of other races and other religions. And even if we don't agree, because of course we're never going to agree on everything, there is a respectful way to disagree without resorting to hateful expression. So yeah, I think it's really important that parents use stories, you know, the seerah, to highlight to our children how we should behave and how we can be empathetic and tolerant to people from other groups.
And one moral point that we can take here, whenever you want to say something, just think, if it hurts us, of course it will hurt them. So I think that's one of the easiest, I would say, moral points that we can think of whenever we try about to say something that whether we are in doubt whether it will hurt them or not.
Yes.
And going further into that, I think one of the things or points that mentioned in your book is about the highlight of Malaysia's strategies to combat the hate speech. So can you share with us what are so far Malaysia's strategies that they have implied and in combating hate speech, and how effective have these strategies been, and perhaps are there any other areas that need further improvement?
Well, good news is recently, sometime this year, we just launched the national policy to prevent violent extremism. And although violent extremism is not exactly hate speech, but hate speech is something that exists before violent extremism, and so it is quite related in that sense. And our government has always taken these issues very, very seriously, alhamdulillah. we have, for example, Siasat, which is an agency under the Ministry of Foreign Relations that does important work on this, not only to do research on the prevention of violent extremism, but also to conduct activities, particularly among the youth and among society, to educate regarding the harms of extremism. And hate speech is something that we can see which results in extremism as well. So these two things are very related. And so there are a lot of good work that we're trying to do. For example, there is now the effort to get teachers on board, influencers, to come up with positive speech, because their platform is huge. And so if they share positive messages to prevent hate speech, then there will be more influence among their audience. So I can see that we are definitely moving in the right direction. But of course, there is always more that we can do. And although law is a useful measure, I feel the most important strategy is, again, highlighting the emphasis on education. And education in different forms for different people, for different groups, even for businesses. Because we think, education for kids, for the youth, for university students. But even businesses need this kind of cultural and religious sensitivity training. For example, H&M, they received a lot of backlash when they had an advertisement which highlighted or depicted an African boy or a boy of African descent, because I'm not sure what is his nationality, but he's of African descent. He was wearing a sweatshirt that said, if I'm not mistaken, something like cutest monkey in the jungle or something like that. And the Caucasian boy was wearing a sweatshirt that was more positive in the messaging. Maybe it was unintentional, that's what they said, but how can they not know that that kind of sweatshirt being put on the boy of African descent would be reinforcing stereotypes against Africans in the first place, and due to the colonial history and so on. And so they receive a lot of backlash because of this. So even businesses need this kind of sensitivity training. And so we need to approach this issue from a very wide perspective, engaging with different stakeholders and ensuring that our education initiatives are tailored to suit the different communities in which we are targeting these initiatives.
So I would say the root of the problem is ignorance. So that's why you share with us about the importance of education. And as we are reaching the end of this conversation, Doctor, what can you say about what would a really comprehensive strategy for combating hate speech look like? And how can governments, civil society organizations, and also educational entity like schools, religious leaders, and technology businesses work together to develop long-term solutions?
In this book that I've published, I talk about a holistic whole-of-nation approach, because I think many of us can sometimes be guilty of putting all the burden on the government. Yes, of course, the government is doing something about this, and yes, of course, the government has a role to play in preventing hate speech in our country, but the government cannot do it alone. And so we actually need to have widespread collaboration with the citizens, with academia, with NGOs, with the media, because we're all in this together.
Involves everyone.
Yes, and so it needs a holistic whole-of-nation approach for it to be successful. But I would like to highlight at least a kind of guideline that I've created based on the good advice of so many other scholars as well, that when we want to respond to hate speech, right, because there is already hate speech in our society, and we are constantly being provoked, whether coming from within Malaysia or abroad. But what we fail to think of is the right way to address or to respond to these type of offensive speech and hateful provocation. And I think if we respond badly or negatively or harshly, it's just going to create more problems. So it is really important for us to actually exercise patience and not just immediately feel like we need to respond with even more hatred. So speak and rationally, be gentle but firm, and that's really important. And do not commit a wrongdoing just to address another wrongdoing, because in the end you're going to create more problems,
Yes.
right? We need to be proportionate and moderate, not only in our words, in the words that we say, but in our actions. We need to always respond to hate with something that is better. And that is the sunnah of the Prophet. Right? He received so much hatred. He received persecution from the Quraysh,
Yes.
but he never responded disproportionately. And as much as he could, he would always try to exercise. He was always patient, and he would always try to be tolerant as much as he could. And it is his kindness and his gentle attitude that won over his enemies. And so it is really important to act with wisdom, because when we act with wisdom, inshallah, we will help to achieve justice and prevent hate speech within our communities.
MashaAllah, Doctor. I learned a lot from today's interview, especially thank you that you gave us tips on how we should respond to hate speech. And Doctor, I believe that your sharing for today, your invaluable insights, help us to better understand the complexities of hate speech and also how it impacts our society. And as we have learned today, addressing hate speech requires a holistic approach, one that balances, as you mentioned earlier, the freedom of expression with accountability, and this promotes education and also empathy, and eventually it will leverage collaboration at all levels, from grassroots communities to international frameworks, not just the responsibility should be on the government only, as you mentioned, to just everyone, as we are all
Right.
involved in this. And with that being said, thank you, Doctor, for your insight on today's sharing
Thank you so much.
on holistic approach to address hate speech. And to our dear listeners, if you would like to share your thoughts or would like to share your comments on today's topic, you can leave it on the comment section of this airing on our Facebook and also through our YouTube, or you can simply leave a message at our WhatsApp at 011-29004004. So be sure to tune in to us next week for more conversation. Stay tuned to IKIM FM, Inspirasi Utama.